since before I was born, I unconsciously assumed its permanence, and so impulsively rejected their argument. But now, observing the daily breadlines for one day, and yet another, and another, their argument hit me with full force. This could not last, not inside Europe. I suddenly realized at one point, even as in calmer moments, I still strongly disbelieved the prospect of a categorical end to the Cold War. I recalled journalist Theodore H. White's visceral reaction to the Honan famine of 1943, and how the sight of masses of starving Chinese peasants effectively convinced him that the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek was illegitimate, and thus could not endure. I had read White's memoir only the previous year in Jerusalem, and some of his pages affected me still in Bucharest. Communism in Romania, in 1981, appeared like something out of a grainy, nightmarish past, an industrial form of feudalism, and yet the Soviet Empire was immeasurably tangible in the eerie submarine silence of these streets, even as it was morally illegitimate. Obviously, Ceausescu's Stalinism was an affront to the Soviet leadership itself, which had moved beyond Stalinism more than a quarter-century earlier, and had long tired of Ceausescu. But totalitarianism in Romania, with the photos of the dictator and his wife on nearly every wall, with a bust of him in every schoolroom, represented, nevertheless, a tolerated variant within Moscow's imperial system. As I would write later in 1984, far from being a bold maverick, Ceausescu, who reigns over a Marxist banana republic of his own making, is a bird singing loudly in a cage. My third morning in Bucharest, 50,000 people marched down the boulevards General Magheru and Nicolae Balcescu, named for the radical luminaries of the 1848 revolutions, shouting, "Ceausescu pace! Ceausescu pace! Ceausescu peace! Ceausescu peace!" The tyrant was hailed as the mythic leader of all world peace and disarmament movements. Massive photos of him and his wife, adorned with ribbons and festooned with blue, yellow, and red Romanian flags, were noisily carried aloft. Near dawn, I had watched as the busloads and truckloads of peasants, hauled in by convoy from the poverty-racked Wallachian countryside, underdeveloped even by Romanian standards, alighted near Piața Universității, close to my hotel, where gangsterish men in black fedoras and long trenchcoats directed them with bullhorns into their parade formations. It was Harvest Day, a festival blatantly manipulated by the regime for its own purposes. Occasionally an order was barked and people ran faster into place. Terror filled the faces of these peasants, many in sleeveless sheepskins, who looked far more wretched than even those at the morning breadlines. "Ceausescu pace! Ceausescu pace!" And yet, the thunderous roar only seemed to intensify the silence I felt everywhere. Silence was the regnant sound of repression. It was Bucharest that led me to Elias Canetti's masterwork, Crowds and Power, 1960, about the manipulation of crowds in both their concrete and virtual forms. Canetti defines the crowd as a mass of people who, knowingly or not, abandon their individuality in favor of an intoxicating collective symbol, ultimately so as to escape loneliness. Always have the same opinions as everyone else, for even if those opinions are proven wrong, the crowd will still protect you, while once outside the crowd, your opinions become suddenly vulnerable. The trick is always to survive the moment, no matter the moral compromises necessary, and worry about the next only when it comes. Standing on the sidewalk of Bulevardul Balcescu, I detected a contest between two crowds. The one marching, composed of a rural peasantry, among the last remaining in Europe, and the one of city dwellers, quietly observing. The crowd of city dwellers evidently could not be trusted, or else why bus in people from outside the city? But the peasants too were suspect according to the regime, if less so. I would later confirm with foreign diplomats that the peasants had been both bribed and bullied to attend the rally. In their personal, family, and group histories, those peasants surely had suffered far worse than merely having to submerge their individual thoughts periodically into the enforced collectivity of a crowd formation. Their relative docility, compared, that is, to the more sullen and untrustworthy city dwellers, was a natural survival mechanism, one born, for example, of the long European War begun in 1914, and still inching forward as a tailpiece in Romania in 1981, even if the war had ended in Western Europe in 1945. Truly, Ceausescu's National Stalinism was a Kremlin-approved substitute for Soviet military occupation, which, in turn, had been the direct product of Stalin defeating Hitler in Central and Eastern Europe. The process of great power conflict, with all its epic hardships and sacrifices, had not ended here yet. In Romania, as late as the 1980s, I could perceptibly close the distance with World War II. East Europeans could adapt to anything, writes Czesław Miłosz, for man is so plastic a being that one can even conceive of the day when a thoroughly self-respecting citizen will crawl about on all fours, sporting a tail of brightly colored feathers, as a sign of conformity to the order he lives in. After all, East Europeans, Romanians in particular, had known territorial dismemberment, occupation, monarchy, military dictatorship, fascism, and communism, all in 1 century, with 2 decades still left to run in it. And by the end of the century, they would also know revolution and democracy. No wonder Romanians had a deep and tragic historical imagination, unlike Americans, who had never known violent upheaval on their soil since 1865. What the historian Modris Eksteins said about life in the trenches of World War I was also true to a significant degree of East Europeans, and especially of Romanians. Honor, glory, heroism, valor, all lose their meaning as the external world consists only of brutality, hypocrisy, illusion. Even the intimate bonds to family have been sundered. Man, Eksteins goes on, remains alone, without a foothold in the real world. Such was not an exaggerated description of the life in Romania in 1981. Dissidence there might be in Warsaw, psychologically buttressed by a Roman Catholic Church that was both universal in its values and nationalistic in its opposition to Soviet domination. But here in Bucharest, I would meet only one such dissident, a lonely and demoralized man with no church or labor union to support him. In 1981 he told me, "Westerners expect Romania to be the next Poland, but it will never happen. There are no martyrs here. One half of the country is informing on the other half." Whereas in countries like Poland and Hungary, there were such things as liberal and reform communists to serve as an unofficial opposition, people like that existed only by the handful in Romania, and made certain to keep their heads bowed, their eyes closed. They barely surfaced except in the final years of the decade. All privately owned typewriters were required to be registered, along with the owner's fingerprints, according to some reports, in order to cut off sources of anti-regime literature. Romanians had simply known no respite, political or economic, since the 1930s. World War II witnessed a Nazi puppet regime, the toing and froing of armies across Romanian territory, and bleak choices about whether to back Stalin or Hitler, following Chamberlain's pact with Hitler. You were nowhere, Silviu Brucan, the grand old man of Romanian communism, would later tell me, referring to how the United States was altogether missing from Central Europe until 1944. And since World War II, 3.5 decades of communism as Oriental despotism had made conditions, by some accounts, worse than in the 1940s, and they would certainly be far worse by the late 1980s. Throughout Romania's history, the country had survived because of clever pliancy, rather than of the heroism of its people. The Romanians possessed to the highest degree the capacity of receiving the blows of destiny while relaxed, writes the Countess R.G. Voldek in a memoir of early 1940s Bucharest. The Romanians, in Valdek's intimation, were not so much fatalists as wise in the ways of history, in which, because there was no end to the process of permutation, there was always the possibility for adaptation and for finding new angles in order to survive. Just as con men had a better chance of surviving the Holocaust than those who played by the rules, Romanians endured the Ceausescu years by corrupting the entire system. Thus, the country that both baffled and fascinated me for 10 days in 1981 was nothing less than a very Latin-style tyranny, a blend of Joseph Stalin and Juan Perón, stuck in the underbelly of Eastern Europe. Even partially understanding it would require years of study and reading that would take me beyond Romania itself, with its utterly chilling and riveting 20th century experience, particularly in the 1930s and 1940s, to the histories of the Habsburg, Byzantine, Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman empires in the Balkans. For the real adventure of travel is mental. It is about total immersion in a place, because nobody from any other place can contact you. You are alone. Thus your life is narrowed to what is immediately before your eyes, making the experience of it that much more vivid and life-transforming. And it wasn't just the cityscape of Bucharest and the other capitals in Eastern and Central Europe I would visit in 1981 that was overpowering, but the conversations with the diplomats, and everyone else too. Real conversations require utter concentration, not texting on the side when you are in a cafe with someone. That is because travel is linear. It is about one place, or singular perception, or book at a time, each one etched deep into memory so as to change your life forever. Eastern Europe in 1981 would impact me as much as that first trip throughout the region in 1973. Both occurred before postmodern communications technology destroyed all but the most extreme forms of travel. For not only could nobody from home contact me, but also there was little real news about the world in the English-language newspapers where I was. The International Herald Tribune was banned in many places or arrived days late. My interactions with the young East Germans, Poles, Hungarians, Romanians, and Bulgarians I met along the way in both 1973 and 1981 were concentrated in the utmost. Indeed, those were rich personal lives I often encountered, precisely because the political and public spaces were so barren. I will never forget those faces, and some of those conversations. For example, 1973 was a summer dominated by news of Watergate, about which, traveling alone in Eastern Europe, I could not have cared less. Like serious reading itself, real travel has now become an act of resistance against the distractions of the electronic age and against all the worries that weigh us down, thanks to that age. A good book deserves to be finished, just as a haunting landscape tempts further experience of it and further research into it. Travel and serious reading, because they demand sustained focus, stand athwart the non-existent attention spans that deface our current time on Earth. The present moment was then sacred. It allowed for the depth of awareness required to truly appreciate history and landscape. The two are inseparable. Landscape requires total and unyielding concentration. How else to tease history out of it? Take the architectural legacy of Bucharest. Byzantine, Brincovano, Ottoman, Renaissance, Venetian Classical, French Baroque, Austrian Secession, Art Deco, and Modernist, all writhing and struggling to break free of a dirty grey sea of pillbox Stalinism, like Michelangelo's unfinished slaves struggling to break free of their marble blocks. The cloud cover and cold weather intensified my cognizance of all the Stalinist monstrosities. Perhaps had that November brought sunlight instead of clouds, I would have been more focused on the earlier architectural periods, but later visits in the 1980s and 1990s would make the cityscape whole to me. Authentic, undistracted travel also introduced me to the challenges of area specialization, spending a professional lifetime in the study of a single geographic, cultural, and linguistic region, blending the appreciation of a particular aesthetic with the requirement for cold-blooded analysis of it. Slavists, Arabists, Sinologists, and so on were people who would become of urgent interest to me thanks to Bucharest. Realism emerges from the tension between moral philosophy and area expertise. The weight of history and landscape limit what can be accomplished in any particular terrain, even as the possibilities for improvement must always exist. The area expert says, this is the way things are in this part of the world. This is the material at hand with which one has to work. The moralist replies, don't be a fatalist. Such oppression and poverty must not be permitted to stand. These are not overwhelming forces about which good men can do nothing. Romania infused me with the wisdom of both positions. Romania's fate in the 1980s was without question a product of its geography, that is, of its closeness to the Soviet Union, even as Romania's distinctive brand of Latinity within Eastern Europe, another product of history and geography, allowed for its psychological isolation. And from that, a peculiar, almost North Korean form of communism could take root. This was the irreducible, deterministic material at hand, with which one had to work, and which area specialists relished. The West was not going to topple such a regime and others nearby by military action, though such fantasies had been entertained by some Americans at the very beginning of the Cold War. The West could only remain militarily and politically vigilant, pressuring the Soviet Union wherever and whenever it could, and hope for the day when internal stresses, in turn arising out of communism's unworkability and moral illegitimacy, would topple the East Bloc from within. Thus was containment, with its aggressive Reaganite component in the final phase, the proper compromise between realism and idealism. Thus were both area experts and moralists vindicated. The American diplomatic corps in Bucharest and other Eastern European capitals during the 1980s represented an exquisite synthesis of both these traditions and tendencies. But I had a long way to go in order to become as wise and mature as they were, for this balance between realism and idealism is something I only have become aware of in retrospect, over the years and decades. It is a balance that I still have not gotten right, and probably never will. My impressions of Bucharest in the early 1980s became a faithful reference point for my thinking, and not always toward a good result. For example, my reporting trips to Iraq later in the 1980s convinced me that Saddam Hussein's regime was unlike any other I had experienced in the Arab world. And yet, in its machinal, totalitarian intensity, it bore a striking resemblance to Ceausescu's in Romania. Thus, when the opportunity arose almost 2 decades later to topple Saddam, I supported the effort, for my obsession with Saddam was derivative of my obsession with Ceausescu. But when that effort turned into an anarchic nightmare worse than the Iraqi regime itself, much like Prince Nikhludov in Tolstoy's Resurrection, I suffered for years a moral nausea which turned into a physical sickness. In my depression I saw the world, including Romania, as I hadn't before. And of the many things I saw more clearly, one was how Reagan was a great president precisely because he had surrounded himself with such realist and pragmatic luminaries as George Shultz, Caspar Weinberger, and James Baker III. Men who understood that as awful as such regimes as Ceausescu's and Saddam's were throughout the world, in the end, their subjects would have to liberate themselves. The United States could not do it for them. As inspirational and unyielding as Reagan's rhetoric was, morally arming the United States against communist oppression in Central and Eastern Europe as never before, Reagan and the men around him never would have countenanced the kind of military action chosen in Iraq. The foreign service officers I met in Eastern Europe during the last decade of the Cold War had internalized that very balance, something else I only fully realized following the debacle in Iraq. Romania's terror in the 1980s had never diminished in my mind, but after Iraq, I understood better that Ceausescu probably could not have fallen any sooner than he did. Reagan could help set history in motion in Eastern Europe, but the specific act of removing a tyrant could only rarely be the work of foreigners. My last evening in Bucharest, in November 1981, I walked with my backpack from the Hotel Muntenia, 3 blocks to Piața Universității, where I took a bus to the North Station. Crossing by train into Bulgaria around midnight, I severed another of many small bureaucratic and psychological links with Israel. In the next few weeks, until 1981 turned to 1982, I traveled through Bulgaria, Macedonia, Kosovo, Serbia, Croatia, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. By the middle of the decade I was reporting from Iraq, Syria, Algeria, North Yemen, and other states in the Arab world, swallowing my fears about being an Israeli citizen, traveling alone in the most radical parts of the Muslim world in order to earn a living. The wars in Afghanistan and the Horn of Africa were also part of my beat. But it was Romania and the rest of the Balkans that principally held my interest throughout the 1980s, places I would return to again and again, usually in the cold weather. I interviewed hundreds in the course of that decade, nuns in Orthodox monasteries, sweaty politicians in cafes, roughnecks drinking plum brandy in train compartments, farmers at collectivized settlements, secondary school students in their classrooms, local historians and intellectuals in the poignant intimacy of their homes and libraries, all in addition to Western diplomats in the magisterial detachment of their embassies. In the July 1989 issue of The Atlantic Monthly, more than 4 months before the Berlin Wall fell, I wrote, "In the 1970s and 1980s, the world witnessed the limits of superpower influence in places like Vietnam and Afghanistan. In the 1990s, those limits may well become visible in a third world region, within Europe itself. The Balkans could shape the end of the century, just as they did the beginning." On November 30th, 1989, less than 3 weeks after the wall fell, I wrote in the Wall Street Journal, "Two historic concepts are emerging out of the ruins of communist Europe. 1. Central Europe, the media is now beating to death. The other, the Balkans, the media has yet to discover. I went on in the article to consider the ethnic fissuring of Yugoslavia. War broke out there 18 months later. By then, I had already completed the writing of a book, Balkan Ghosts, which, though its early chapters dealt with Yugoslavia, devoted its largest section to Romania. My fixation with the region, and its distinctive otherness compared to the rest of Europe, was a function of what I had first experienced as a journalist in Romania. The Balkans may not have had, at least theoretically, an especial predisposition to war and conflict, but the region's very poverty and underdevelopment relative to the rest of the continent, and especially relative to the rest of the Warsaw Pact, further inflamed its historical disputes. My reporting depressed an American president on the possibilities of stopping a war in the former Yugoslavia. I saw it differently. From the beginning, I supported armed intervention there. Nor did that contradict what I had written in Balkan Ghosts. After all, it is only the darkest human landscapes where humanitarian action is ever required in the first place. And before one intervenes anywhere, the worst about a place should be known in advance and discussed by officials directing the invading force. The invasion of Iraq ultimately failed because the depth of the suspicion between Sunnis and Shiites was not adequately admitted and planned for. Still, whatever I intended, the book's reported effect in policy terms was, to say the least, tragic. Thus, if it is not guilt that I feel, it is profound sorrow. A writer, as I've said, must honestly describe what he sees and hears during a moment in time, regardless of the consequences. But sometimes the consequences can be difficult to bear. Romania was my master key for the Balkans. Here was the Poland of southeastern Europe in terms of size, demography, and geopolitical location vis-à-vis the Soviet Union. The ultimate marchland, a vast territory hacked to pieces by invading armies, and constituting the frontier extremities of the Byzantine, Ottoman, Habsburg, and Russian empires, even as the language itself signaled a longing for the Latin West. At the beginning of the modern era, Ottoman, Habsburg, and Russian forces all converged where Romania now lies. The Carpathians, which snake through the heart of the country, separated Europe from the Near East, or more specifically, Central Europe from Eastern Europe, as much as any single geographical gradation could. Though Ceausescu happened to be the Russian-tolerated voivoda at the time of my early visits, Romania carried the seeds of other, manifold hopes and legacies, even if finding them back then was a matter of groping in the darkness. Chapter 2. Bucharest, 2013. A third of a century later, I returned to the Romanian capital. It was Holy Week, the marrow of orthodoxy. There is no greater union of the sensual and the spiritual than the swinging, censer-blackened icons and frescoes of the interior of an Eastern church, floating in frankincense, with inscriptions in Cyrillic, and hymns on Good Friday sung in Greek. Near Saturday midnight, the Biserica Alba, White Church, in Bucharest, was entrenched in darkness as people filtered in quietly from the Cala Victoriei. Young couples with children and grandparents, ravishing women and destitute crones, each clutching an unlit candle. An otherworldly awe and humility erasing the differences between them. The hymns evoked a melodious and somber deliverance, an irresistible undertow. Finally, two priests arrived from behind the iconostasis with flaming candelabras. People surged forward to have their candles lit. Then each person lit another's with his own, until a forest of light swept from the front of the church to the back and into the courtyard, annihilating the darkness. It was Easter. Christus einviat. Christ has risen. Adeveratka einviat. In truth, he has risen. Spring had been initiated in this most pagan ritual of monotheism. History is never so real as in the candle-lit faces of Romanians at Easter. You can read every tragedy, every miracle, and every restoration in their eyes. The Doric neoclassical church dated only to the early 19th century, but the fact that I connected it to one of Gregor von Retzori's stories of late 1920s Bucharest in Memoirs of an Anti-Semite made it old. The early 19th century, like the Middle Ages, is an abstraction to someone born in the mid-20th. It is far too removed to bond with any living memory. But my father was born 5 years before Rizzori, and was almost 20 years old during the period Rizzori describes. My father would now be well over 100, if alive. My father at 20. Now that's old. Between the setting of Rizzori's story and the present, the Jews that Rizzori describes, not always politely, not always sympathetically, might well have been killed in the Holocaust, and if not, would have had to survive a Nazi-allied regime and decades of communist-inflicted terror and poverty in Romania, unless they had been lucky enough to emigrate. Here was history, unimaginably compressed, for the 1930s and 1940s constitute an unfathomable chasm between one epoch and another. And for Romania, to a greater extent than elsewhere in Eastern Europe, it was a chasm that lasted until 1989. Rizzori's story lay on one side of the chasm. My life lay on the other. Such were my thoughts at Easter midnight, the whirling mystery of time and what it meant. The Biserica Alba in the late 1920s, my visit to Bucharest in 1981, and my return now in early 2013. 1981 now seemed remote, the 1920s less so. I could almost touch the Bucharest of Rizzori's story, though it had existed before I was born, though it seemed so further removed in time than the 1820s. Rizzori recalls a summer of lavender-blue skies and unfulfilled longings in Bucharest, listening in a tiny apartment to a chorus from a garden restaurant behind the Biserica Alba. Soon his youthful protagonist would move into a rooming house run by a Jewish family, and the theme of these stories would present itself, that of antisemitism as background noise, as a minor personal tic exhibited by all the Romanian characters, the more shocking, because it comes across as normal and understated. The horror noticed only because of Rizzori's gentle, occasional reminders that this is the 1920s and 1930s he is talking about. The inference of what would come afterward is left to the reader. This interwar period in Central and Eastern Europe was one of a light extinguished. The light of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a vivid world of Biedermeier furniture, interposed with folkloric peasant weavings, of a withering Habsburg gentility overlaid on a turbulent political carpet of ethnic minorities, a world in dangerously exposed disarray. Though this world lay on the far side of my own lifetime, when my father was still very young, Rizzori, an Austrian from the Bukovina, brought it close by. For the more recent in actual time, the more distant it may seem, one's own life, with all of its intervening events of such supreme personal importance, can make relatively recent history, the history concurrent with one's childhood, appear far, far away. One's own life distorts historical time, in other words. I was born only 7 years after World War II ended, I suddenly realized one day in middle age, when 7 years no longer seemed like a long time, given that I had accumulated memories going back 5 decades. And so, the interwar and fascist periods in Romania arose real and substantial, even as the communist 1950s and 1960s, when I was still a child and teenager, became dim and unimaginably ancient. Only the candle-lit faces I saw at Easter conquered those distances, making them all cohere. Easter 2013 in Bucharest also illuminated the work of Patrick Lee Fermer, that craftsman of irreducible, godlike essences, whose every sentence belongs in a time capsule. To call him a mere travel writer is to diminish him. I first read Fermer's rich descriptions of Romania in 1986, immediately upon the publication of Between the Woods and the Water, when the glacis of communism still constituted an almost impenetrable barrier for traveling back in time to the 1930s, rendering his words antique, almost. But in late 2013, when the next volume of his series finally appeared posthumously in Great Britain, his descriptions of 1930s Bucharest were altogether immediate and touchable. The shop fronts with dashing modernistic lettering, one of them ultra-chic, containing a single gleaming scent flagon poised on a softly lit pyramid of dove-colored velvet against a backdrape of ruched lemon-yellow silk, the ferro-concrete facades, the rainbow tangle of electric signs, the blazing kiosks with their polyglot flutter of periodicals, interiors of unimaginable splendor. Bucharest, for Fermor, was a fascinating nightmare and an over-upholstered Babylon. Decades of communism would pulverize it all, and in 2013, Bucharest was now still in the process of rebirth. Romania is truly a wondrous geographical and cultural confection. Its effect on me has always been both corporeal and abstract, leading in ways direct and indirect to a fixation with orthodox icons, with the Cold War, time travel, and much else. Romania, it was, until some intermediate point in the Cold War. The change might have been the partial result of Romania in the Romanian language becoming Romania in the 1960s. But I always preferred the earlier English spelling and pronunciation, more suggestive as it was of the Balkans somehow, and thus seemingly more real. Romania, as I am forced to refer to it, constitutes one of those indigestible ethnic nations, like Georgia and Armenia, that have miraculously survived the millennia despite being oppressed, overrun, and vanquished. Yet, Romanians have survived thus on a grander demographic scale than the peoples of the Transcaucasus, and have done so on the very edge of Central Europe. There was so much I had to be reacquainted with, to adjust to. The decades between late 1981 and early 2013 had seen several evolutions in Romanian manners, which I had experienced firsthand in the course of 2 short visits, in 1990 and 1998. Returning barely 4 months after the 1989 Christmas Revolution, I saw how Bucharest, denied religion for decades, had been transformed into an open-air church, with roses, tulips, and beeswax candles at sacrificial pavement offerings in honor of the revolutionaries who had died fighting Ceausescu. By the late 1990s, downtown Bucharest would boast casinos, topless clubs, and Italian fashions in boutique windows that in one instance featured live models. As in New York and Paris at the time, black apparel was chic. A former Romanian diplomat, Iona Ieronim, told me in 1988, "This is how we were in the interwar period in the 1930s. We are resourceful, adaptable, exaggerated, pseudo-cosmopolitan émigrés in a new global world. We are one-dimensional Latin-Oriental clones of the West." A local philosopher and essayist, Horia Roman Potapievich, added, "When we buy computers, compact discs, and clothes, we borrow the material consequences of the West, without grasping the fundamental values that created such technologies in the first place." Potapievich, in his book-lined apartment during the late 1990s, with the hallways plagued by stray dogs, and wearing jeans and a smoking jacket, condensed for me all that was intoxicating to me about Romania, a country resembling a sensual, macabre, perpetually fascinating and occasionally brilliant film noir. But to scratch the surface was not enough. The more I had opportunities to write at length about other parts of the world, parts I had not yet seen even, the more I merely wanted to return to Romania and complete the picture I had been forming from earlier visits. I wanted to reacquaint myself with the country, not as a trained historian with an advanced degree, which I wasn't, not as a memoirist whose linguistic gifts were matched by an equally fantastic family background like Rezzori, which I was not either, nor was I a literary travel writer like Fermor, armed with social gifts and the perfect metaphor always at the ready. I was a journalist with an obsession about one place, and about what lessons that place could teach us, and teach me, about Europe and the period of history through which I was fated to live. Simply because Rezzori and Fermor were, in terms of their skills of observation, unapproachable, did not mean that Romania had to be retired as a subject of concern. It was too important for that, located as it was close to Ukraine, Russia, Central Europe, the Black Sea, and the Mediterranean. I began, not with people, but with art and architecture, the material elements of a civilization that the communists had tried for decades to undermine. I wanted to experience Romania's material heritage after color had poured back into the landscape, without the burden of the crushing gray immensity of oppression, the memory of the cityscape of 1981 that still haunted me. At the 300-year-old palace of Mogoșoaia, outside Bucharest, the church steeples resemble Turkish minarets, the wafer-thin brick half-domes and brick archways, the later held up by marble half-columns, recall the early medieval Byzantine world emerging out of late Roman antiquity, even as the steep leaden roofs yearn toward the Baroque. I lost myself in the beauty of Muntenian carpets and Oltenian and Moldavian kilims, all colored in rich vegetable dyes, heavily influenced by the patterns of Turkey and Persia. For Muntenia and Oltenia are both sub-regions of the broad plain of Wallachia, where Bucharest sits, less than 40 miles north of the Danube, subject from late antiquity to the early modern age of the hoofbeats of Byzantine and Ottoman armies. Before becoming the capital of Romania, Bucharest was the capital of Wallachia, adjacent to Ottoman-occupied Bulgaria, from where the Turks could launch raids and invasions. The tragic Wallachian prince, Constantine Brâncoveanu, who built this palace between 1698 and 1702, and whose name is associated with Romania's haunting architectural design system of Western and Oriental styles, was himself taken to Constantinople with his 4 sons and a son-in-law, and beheaded there by the Turks in 1714, his sons dying first before his eyes. Brâncoveanu had been forced